Okay, so I think we're live. And good evening and welcome once again to the Nation's Trust Bank WNPS lecture series. Always interesting encounter to be engaged in. And today I think I'm a bit, I would say extra excited because it's a super cracking session. Horton is one of my favorite places and I can't think of a better person than Rohan to kind of do the honors today. How many of you know that Thomas More and Rohan actually discovered Baker's Falls? Not really. Rohan's father was a planter and they were in Lidula, so that's just about an hour away. And as a kid, he used to be hanging out a lot because his father would do some trout fishing there. And, these 13-year-old kids, not Thomas More that you would have thought of, but certainly someone with a similar name, a young kid. The two of them, walking down, they'd enjoyed discovering the falls one day. And, that gives you an insight into the kind of childhood that Rohan had around Horton Plains. So he's had many years growing up. Much later, he fell in love with the place, started, doing scientific work. Later with Dr. Nimal and Savitri, they got a lot deeper into the scientific work. I'm not reading off his bio. He has a very interesting bio, but just bits and pieces are picked up around, Rohan's romance with Horton. And he spent, a fair portion of his life dedicated to Horton. Right, so Rohan, of course, is a biodiversity scientist. He's published widely. Right, he's a biomedical engineer by training, and at the tender age of, I would say, of 32, he kind of and he's published more than 60 research papers. We're very proud that Rohan used to be also our former editor of Loris. So Rohan is, his connections in WNPS also go back very, very, very long way. Right. Rohan, a lot of his work was through the Wildlife Heritage Trust, WHT, which he set up in 1991. And they've done some phenomenal work over the years. They've published, there have been about 40 titles since then. And, they built up one of the largest specimen collections for research, which he later gifted to the National Museum in 2009. And what is wonderful is that the WHT helped nurture and bring up a number of young biodiversity specialist researchers, right? And it's being hands which kind of help the professionals of today and tomorrow protect the diversity in Sri Lanka. So there's a lot more interesting stuff here, but I'm sure Rohan will pardon me if I, cut through the chase, right? And jump straight in. Rohan's been also, holding several leading positions in government in different advisory capacities. And he was also the deputy chair of the Species Survival Commission. A very special, I think, for all of us is that he was also a recipient, certainly a lot of international acclaim by getting the Rolex Award. And, Rohan continues to stay very, very engaged and he's very passionate about conservation, as you will find out when we switch over to him. So with that, let me welcome and hand the podium over to Rohan Pethiyagoda. Rohan, welcome.
Thank you, Sriyan. I just want to check that I'm being heard. Can you confirm that I can be heard and seen?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, just checking that you can see my screen and that I can get started. Can you give me a thumbs up? Good, excellent. Thank you very much, Sriyan. Very grateful for that generous introduction. Before I get started, I should clarify, because of the publicity that's gone around this talk, that I'm just Rohan Pethiyagoda, not Dr. Rohan Pethiyagoda. And when I see some of the doctors and professors on television nowadays, I'm kind of grateful for that. But I think the place to start here is by acknowledging that pretty much everyone listening this evening has probably been to Horton Plains. And having been there, you probably come away with ideas about how the place should be managed, what you'd do differently if only you were the park warden or you were the Director General of Wildlife Conservation. I know that this is a common topic of conversation with everyone who's come away from a national park in Sri Lanka. I, however, want to try and focus on some issues that center on science, because I want to make it clear to the WNPS audience and fellowship how pivotally important science is to the way in which we view conservation in Sri Lanka. This is something we sometimes forget. So in managing a park like Horton Plains, I think the way I would approach it is by setting up a goal. And the goal I would establish would contain 3 elements. The most important thing here, I think, is that we need to ensure that the evolutionary processes operating on the park continue, but continue in a way that they would have had there been no human disturbance of the environment, of the landscape. At the same time, we need to ensure that as many people as possible can visit the park. Now you quickly see that this goal is at odds with itself. But let's go through those elements one by one. First of all, we need to recognize that when we make an intervention in an evolutionary process, even our best science today can't predict the outcomes. So we can change something now, but we have no idea what evolution is going to do by way of a response in 10, 100, or 1,000 years from now as a result of that intervention. And evolution, of course, operates in the time frame of millions of years. So we need to think about every intervention we make in the context of the best science that we have and try and make sure that what we're doing is worthwhile. If you just think about even the short term of 18 months in which the COVID virus has been around, already in the space of a year and a half, it has developed more than 50 different strains as a result of mutation. Now, not even the best scientists in the world who are giving their mind to COVID can predict what the next mutation is going to be, where it's going to occur, or what its character is going to be like. So this is a really complicated thing. So when we give our attention to reversing or addressing the changes that we have brought about in the park as a result of human occupation of this landscape, we're really shooting in the dark. If you think about what it will take for us to return atmospheric carbon dioxide to pre-industrial levels, for example, it's going to be a century at least, maybe several centuries. For us to even grow corridors of forest to reduce the problem of fragmentation, if we were going to grow corridors of forest between adjacent fragments of forest, for example, Horton Plains on the one side and Piduru Thalagala on the other, these are processes that will take several centuries to achieve. So we are looking at really long time frames. And design, scientific design, is therefore pivotally important to what we're trying to do. At the same time, increasing numbers of people want to go and enjoy the park. And we have to allow that as well, because it's our gate fees and our taxes that pay for the maintenance of the park in the first place. So we have to accept that our goal is not just unachievable, it is unknowable. Even our best science applied right now can only achieve an approximation to where we want to get to. So with those caveats in mind, let's look at how we could go forward. First off, I don't want to discuss the day-to-day management issues of the park. Issues like litter, garbage disposal, visitor behaviors, firewood collection, gem mining, people bathing in the river without permission. That's me, by the way. And encroachment into the park, or even illegal collecting and biopiracy. The reason I'm going to ignore all that is because the staff of the DWLC, under the leadership of the present warden, Mr. Pradeep Kumara, are doing a fantastic job at managing those issues. So there's no need for me to add my 2 cents worth to that narrative. Instead, I want to pick a few issues about which I want to share some thoughts and try and provoke from you, the audience today, also some thoughts. So I'm not going to tell you what I think. I'm just going to share some of the science that has been revealed over the past couple of decades and see how you would react in terms of how the park could be managed in the light of such science. The solutions I'm going to offer are almost uniformly going to annoy some of you. When I was an undergrad and had to follow a course in advanced mathematics, my professor chose to teach wave theory through the medium of a violin. His reasoning was that he couldn't play the violin, and therefore by teaching us wave theory through the violin, we would pay no attention to the violin. In fact, the violin would annoy us because it's an irritating instrument if played by somebody who can't play it. And so we would all be equally unhappy about the instrument and thereby focus on the wave theory. Similarly, I'm going to suggest to you interventions on this park that some of you will not like, but the whole idea is that we should have a conversation, a narrative, a discourse about how we approach conservation in a sensitive place like Horton Plains, because similar interventions have to be considered for all our sensitive areas, whether it's the Knuckles, Singaraja, Kannaliya, Kottava, Hiniduma, wherever. We need to think carefully about how we manage these sensitive sites. So I'm going to start with the phenomenon of forest dieback. When you visit Horton Plains, one of the first things you see is that vast stands of trees in the forest canopy are dead or dying. A tree like this is probably several centuries old. It's a relic. And its death is something that we need to think very carefully about. But thousands of trees are dying all over Horton Plains. At the top of Totopolakanda, there's barely a tree left now because of this phenomenon of canopy dieback. This was discovered first in the 1970s, and since then, we know that about 1,000 hectares of Horton Plains is dead or dying. If you draw a 1,000-hectare rectangle on an aerial map of Horton Plains, it encompasses the entire area between Anderson Lodge, Far Inn, Bakers Falls, and World's End. It's a massive area. And of course, it's not one area that's dying. These stands of dieback are occurring all over Horton Plains. But dieback isn't unique to Sri Lanka. It's not even unique to the montane zone. In certain parts of the world, lowland forests are experiencing dieback. In the temperate part of the world, there's evidence of dieback and so on. But I think in every area in which dieback is occurring, the causative factors are different. So we need to think about the Sri Lankan experience in the context of the world, of course, but we need to think of the Sri Lankan experience as being special, and it has to be researched independently. But if you look at an example of dieback in Europe, for example, studies over the past century of climate suggest that when the dry period between consecutive wet periods becomes longer, when you have longer droughts between rains, it leads to the dying off of certain trees in the canopy. Now, that's one factor that we could consider. We don't have long-term weather data for Horton Plains, but if you look at Norelia, which is close by, we can see that in the course of the last century and a half, rainfall in Norelia declined by 20%. That's a massive proportion. At the same time, because of global warming, the temperature in Norelia rose by more than 1 degree Celsius. Now, when temperature rises, there's more evaporation from the soil, there's more evapotranspiration from the foliage, and taken together with reduced rainfall, you could have hydraulic stress of the vegetation. But annual rainfall isn't a good indicator because there are so many factors that make rainfall change dramatically from year to year. strengthening and weakening monsoonal winds, the Indian Ocean dipole, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, all these factors combine to provide us with the weather that we experience. So much more informative is the seasonality of weather, of rainfall within each year. And here I've plotted a series of graphs of approximate monthly rainfall from several stations in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, for Horton Plains, we have rainfall data only for a single 12-month period between 1993 and 1994. If that's anything to go by, and Horton Plains is here on the bottom right, if you compare that with Norelia on the bottom left, you can see that the weather pattern, the monthly weather pattern on Horton Plains is very different from that at Norelia. Horton Plains seems to be more similar to dry zone places like Trincomalee than to Norelia. And what's most striking about the distribution of rainfall is the 3 wet months at the end of the year, October, November, December, just like in the dry zone, and dry months in the middle of the year between June and August. Now, we know from across Asia that when monthly rainfall decreases to under 100 millimeters in more than 2 consecutive months, that rainforest cannot persist. And on Horton Plains, we are getting close to that boundary, at least from the 1 year for which we have data. Because June and August in 1993-94 is either at or below 100 millimeters. If we look at long-term trends, we'd be able to understand this better. But unfortunately, it was only earlier this year, a couple of months ago, that finally the Tea Research Institute installed a climate monitoring system at Horton Plains. These data are still not in the public domain. If you have influence over the Tea Research Institute, I urge you to speak to the chairman and the director, and please ask them to put this data in the public domain, because the more scientists that can crunch such data and compare these to other stations in Sri Lanka as proxies, for example, the better we can understand what climate is likely to do and the effects it will have on the vegetation and biodiversity of Horton Plains. So there's one problem. If we look at another side of the ecology of Horton Plains, something that we all notice when we go there is very often the forest is enveloped in mist. In fact, this can be quite annoying, because if you've gone up to take your kids to look at World's End, for example, and it's misted up like this, you don't get a good view. Horton Plains is known as a tropical montane cloud forest. And this means that for much of the time, the cloud level is low enough to touch the ground and certainly to touch the vegetation. It presents itself as mist. And many of the trees in Horton Plains that reach the canopy have got leaves that are specialized. They're called sclerophyll leaves that are specialized in having mist water condense on them. They're waxy on their surface, and the mist water condenses and drips down to the forest floor. So in addition to rainfall, this vegetation is specialized in capturing mist water. Now, Horton Plains doesn't receive a lot of rain. If it's anything like Norelia, it's on the borderline of what we would call intermediate zone, with about 2,000 millimeters of rain per year. But the addition of mist water to the hydrological cycle is hugely relevant. Many of the trees you see on Horton Plains have got epiphytes, lichens, filmy ferns, mosses, liverworts, and so on like this. And these are specialized, they're adapted to extracting, to stripping water from the mist. They act like sponges. So as the mist passes through the canopy, this vegetation is extracting water, it's retaining water, and the excess water is dripped down to the roots. So this supplemental water also is pivotal to the ecology of the Horton Plains. But there is a problem. We know from studies in Costa Rica that when the area around a tropical montane cloud forest becomes deforested, when you cut down the forest, as is the case in Horton Plains, because right around Horton Plains is on the Diagama side, and on the Haputale side is tea. On the northern side towards Norelia is grassland for the cattle farms. it's surrounded by a deforested landscape. And when that happens, the cloud table tends to rise. And it can rise by as much as 200 meters. Now, this means that there's less mist passing through the canopy, and therefore less mist being absorbed by the vegetation. So that too could add to hydrological stress to the plants. That in turn may contribute to the phenomenon of canopy dieback. Then we have a study from the mid-1990s that shows that the mist that is passing through the canopy on Horton Plains is highly acidic. This study showed that the pH of the mist was less than 4. That would be seriously acidic, and enough to cause acid damage to foliage. Now, the problem is mist is able to absorb pollutants preferentially to rain, because mist water droplets are much smaller than rainwater droplets, and therefore they have a much higher area through which to absorb pollutants from the air. But we have never measured or monitored the quality of air on Horton Plains. As a result of that, we have no idea what pollutants are passing through. And this brings us to the next possible area of stress, which is heavy metals. This recent study by Professors Gunadasa and Yapa at the University of Sabaragamuwa showed that in dieback stands, the level of lead in the soil is extremely high. They show that when the level of lead in the soil exceeds about 60 parts per million, dieback occurs. And in many of these dieback stands, they found that the level of lead exceeds 100 parts per million. So this is a very worrying phenomenon. Now, we don't know where this lead is coming from because we don't have monitoring studies, but this is part of the research that needs to get done. We don't have lead in petrol, of course, because the Petroleum Corporation since 2003 stopped adding lead to our petrol. I was environment advisor at the time to the government, and Mr. Daham Vimalasena was the chairman of the corporation, and it took me only 15 minutes to sit him down and explain why we need to stop leaded petrol in Sri Lanka, and he immediately gave an order that we should do so. Going back to the study of Gunadasa and Yapa, they showed, interestingly, not just that the problem was occurring because of heavy metals in the soil, but what we might be able to do about it. So they had a treatment by enriching soil organic matter, for example, by adding compost, to see whether that would make a difference. And they found that when they added compost to the soil where dieback was occurring, it reduced, it attenuated the extent of dieback. Now, as I told you earlier, we have 1,000 hectares, 10 square kilometers of dieback on Horton Plains. Adding compost to that soil is going to be a huge challenge, and we don't know if that will address the problem in the long term. So it needs, again, a body of research to be done. So what I've tried to illustrate in this first example is that even this single problem we have of canopy dieback is enormously complicated. There are multiple factors at play here: depleted soils, a longer dry period, rising temperatures, acid mist and rain, the loss of epiphytes from the trees, wind speed, which can desiccate the landscape, the rising cloud table, and so on. And all these interact with each other in ways that we still don't understand. We don't know which factors are relevant and which factors are not. And it's enough to make your head spin. I think of this rather like I think of chronic kidney disease in northern Sri Lanka. There are multiple factors at play, and we need the best brains in the country to address their minds to a problem like this. But even the best brains in the country can't do anything with it because we don't have data. So we need to have extensive monitoring on places like Horton Plains. That is the first intervention we need to put in place. Now, we've just started measuring climate and logging climate data every 15 minutes. The TRI data recorded logs this data, but we need to look at air quality, rainwater quality, mist water quality, soil quality across the matrix in even this very small national park. I want to leave canopy dieback there and move on to alien species, which is another problem that we have to grapple with. Now, I think those of you who've gone to Horton Plains over the space of the last several years or decades will remember that the plains used to be dominated by this conspicuous shrub, Ilex europaeus, which we call gorse, which was introduced by the British 100 and something years ago. And gorse became an invasive on the grasslands in Horton Plains. And a few years ago, the Wildlife Department decided that they'd remove gorse from Horton Plains. And several NGOs, probably the WNPS members as well, helped the Wildlife Department to uproot the gorse, take it away and have it destroyed or burnt. When we uproot an invasive species like gorse, we leave some bare earth remaining. And we find now that on that bare earth where gorse was previously growing, what are growing are not native Sri Lankan species, but again, alien species, foreign species. So we have Pennisetum grass or Aristia growing in the areas where gorse was uprooted. Now, the problem when you uproot gorse is because gorse is a prolifically seeding shrub. The seeds tend to fall onto the bare earth and get buried under the soil. The problem with gorse is that each shrub generates tens of thousands of seeds. And these seeds can lie in the soil for a generation, for 20 or 30 years, and remain viable, only to spring up, to germinate at some time in the future. So we may not have solved the problem by just uprooting and destroying the gorse. Because one day in the future, you'll find that it comes up again, and you might not find it that easy to get rid of it the second time around, because by then your whole landscape has evolved into a different vegetation. Now, in some places, like in Western Australia, which is also a biodiversity hotspot, by the way, they have a higher diversity of plants there than we have in all of Sri Lanka. They control gorse by using herbicides like glyphosate. Now, at the level of a landscape like Horton Plains, I know that that would not be popular, but if you use a herbicide in a controlled way, it can be very effective. For example, rather than uprooting the gorse, you cut it off at the level of the ground, you coppice it, and then you damage the stump, spray a little herbicide on it, close it up with some plastic and a rubber band for a few months, and that'll kill the stump and the root. And this has been tested in New Zealand, for example, and found to be quite successful. But again, we need to have that conversation. Are we going to use herbicides in a sensitive place like Horton Plains? I would say, yes, it's safe, but many of you would say, no, it's not. So that's why we need to have this discourse. We also need to recognize that there are two kinds of grassland on Horton Plains. One of these is like the one you see here, which is the result of the potato cultivation that took place on about 1,000 acres of the grassland in Horton Plains in the 1960s. What happened with the potato cultivation is that they brought up cattle manure to fertilize potatoes, and the manure contained the seeds of grasses that had been imported from abroad as fodder grasses, as pasture grasses for the cattle farms at places like Amphibian and Pattipola. And these grasses were much more aggressive than the native grasses on Horton Plains. And so we have basically 1,000 acres of pasture grass that is not native growing on Horton Plains in areas like this. You can still see the terraces of the potato cultivation. The rest of the landscape of the Horton Plains grasslands have native grasses, but even these are probably the result of historical burning. We know that as at 1883, when Ernst Heckl, a German biologist, visited Horton Plains, he reported that the whole grassland was burnt by herdsmen who brought their cattle up during the month of September in preparation for the end year rains, which would yield a new growth of grass and thereby new pasture for their cattle. What we know from the work of Professor Ratnasiri Premathilaka, who looked at deep cores in the swampland in Horton Plains, at the pollen that has been deposited there over thousands of years. He could go back almost 30,000 years. And he shows that humans have been on Horton Plains for at least 10,000 years and probably as long as 13,000 years. And wherever humans have gone in the past, they have taken fire with them. So we can assume that the grasslands of Horton Plains, at least in part, are the result of periodic burning. But in the past, when the grassland was burnt, it resulted in new grass growing. Now we have a different problem. We have alien species that have been brought to Sri Lanka. Now, alien species have been brought to Sri Lanka, the ones in Horton Plains, largely as garden plants. They were brought for the purpose of horticulture, whether for the gardens of plantation bungalows or the gardens at Heckl and so on. And most of these plants, like most garden plants, are adapted to growing in direct sunlight. If you think about rainforest plants, they're adapted to starting their lives in shade. So they're at a disadvantage. When you have a vast area like a fire burning up an area of grassland, what now succeeds the burnt grass is not new native grass or even alien grass. It is a shrub like Osteoporous. So this light green expanse you see on the hillside is a Mexican or Central American shrub called Osteoporous. It is an extremely aggressive shrub that provides such dense shade of the soil that nothing else can grow beneath it. And we've tested how to get rid of Osteoporous. Now, herbicides like glyphosate work very well, but again, at the level of the landscape in Horton Plains, even I am against using herbicides. This is a dangerous thing to do, so we have to count that out. The most effective way of suppressing Osteoporous looks like shade netting. If we put up shade netting, 40–50% shade, we know that the Osteoporous becomes suppressed, and very soon the native vegetation is able to take root in the shade of the netting. But if we wanted to put up shade netting on hillsides, entire hillsides on Horton Plains, it's going to have a terrible visual appearance and going to detract from the attraction of the park for visitors. So we need to balance that against stakeholders from the tourism industry, for example. But we may have a very slow but natural process by which Osteoporous is now being replaced. Because in some areas, we have bracken, a kind of fern, the dark brown region you see between the hillside Osteoporous and the grassland in the foreground. Bracken is slowly invading the Osteoporous after about 40 years, very slow process. And within the bracken, you can see that there are native rhododendron trees beginning to grow. Now, this is good news because rhododendron becomes a tree of about 10 meters in height, dense foliage, therefore heavy shade. And when rhododendron grows up into a tree, which will probably take another 50 to 100 years, these trees will provide so much shade that it'll kill the bracken underneath them, and it'll also kill the grassland and enable forests to grow. Now, the reason rhododendron is successful on these grasslands is because it's one of the few species in the tropical montane cloud forest, one of the few tree species that is resistant to frost. And frost is quite common in the grasslands at Horton Plains. Rhododendrons is not killed by frost. And additionally, for the past century, we haven't had big fires on Horton Plains. In the first half of the 20th century, until about 1970, the Trout Fishing Club protected the Horton Plains and made sure that fires were suppressed. After about 1970, the Forest Department and the Wildlife Department have done a fantastic job in keeping down the risk of fire. So now, as a result of that, we see a process of succession occurring on Horton Plains as a result of these dense aggregates of rhododendron growing on the grasslands and amidst the bracken. And 50, 100 years from now, this will probably begin the process of restoring native montane forest on these slopes. So the grassland is disappearing. That might not be a bad thing. At the same time, some very preliminary studies suggest that the forest itself is slowly invading the grassland, very slowly, at a few percent in terms of area per decade. But this transition also seems to be happening. And if that is the case, it's another good sign that we're getting more forests being established on this grassland. But we can't look at the Horton Plains in isolation. I like to think of it in terms of the southern region of the Western Ghats, which is about the same latitude and the same altitude as Horton Plains, around 2,000 meters in elevation. And if you look at a similar landscape in the Western Ghats, for example, in the Annamale Hills or the Palani Hills or the Nilgiri Hills, this is pretty much what you see. It looks very similar to the Horton Plains, except they still have elephants on these slopes. They still have gaur, which are now extinct in Sri Lanka. They have the Nilgiri tar, they have samba, and a different mix of herbivores. As a result of that, their grasslands are probably more intensely grazed than ours are. And also they didn't have the problem of potato cultivation. So there's no invasion of rhododendron into the Nilgiri grasslands. And they still have common frost occurring on the grassland, and the frost doesn't occur in the forest. But they have found a new problem there, which we need to be very careful about here. And that is the problem of another alien species, Acacia. On the borders of Horton Plains, in fact, right around the Horton Plains, on the Diagama side, on the Belioloa side, on the Pattipola and Ohia sides, we can see in the disturbed lands surrounding the Horton Plains, 2 species of acacia. There might be others. Now, acacia are an Australian tree, very pretty tree, as you can see, a legume that also produces large numbers of seeds. The difference with acacia is that the seeds need a fire cycle in order to germinate. So unless the seeds are heated or go through fire, they don't germinate. This is a natural part of the Australian ecology. It's not a natural part of Sri Lanka's highland ecology because forest fires are very rare in Sri Lanka. Rainforest doesn't usually burn, it's only grass that burns. But the problem is the acacia seeds or pods are eaten by birds, eaten by monkeys, and so on. And so by now, after these acacia species have been around for the last 20 or 30 years, their seeds are probably everywhere on the grasslands of Horton Plains. If we have a fire now, these seeds are going to germinate. And acacias are very robust, hardy, aggressive trees. We know from experience in Agra Patana at an elevation of about 1,700 meters just below the Horton Plains, that when you clear an area of land, for example, after a fire, immediately what grows are Osteoporous from Central America and acacias from Australia. The Osteoporous occupies the sub-canopy, if you will, the first 2 or 3 meters of shrubbery. And then the acacias grow up to about 10 or 15 meters in height. All this happens in a space of just 8 years. But even after 20 years, we know from this example, this is a stable ecosystem in stasis. It is very difficult to shake off once it happens. So if there's a fire on the grassland at Horton Plains now, we run a high risk of having this vegetation establish itself. And this is going to be a devil of a job to get rid of. So it's very important that we set our minds to how we're going to control fire in the grasslands of Horton Plains now. Mind you, this problem happened in the Nilgiris, and we need to learn from them because they have fires much more often than we do in Horton Plains. So let's learn from that example and think how we can prevent fires from happening on Horton Plains, especially on the grasslands. The problem is there's no fire control solution that is also elegant visually. Every fire control solution we can think of, apart from regenerating forest on this grassland, is somehow visually unappealing. So we need to think about how can we restore forest on this grassland. Now, as we saw earlier, rhododendrons are naturally becoming established on the grasses that used to be burnt in the past. But they can't become established on the pasture grasses that are growing on the 1,000 acres of former potato cultivation for a reason that we'll come to in a minute. But if we look back at historical photographs and aerial photographs taken by the survey department in the course of the last century, for example, we can learn a lot about how vegetation evolves in the time frame of decades. This photograph, for example, shows us an area of the lower slope of Adams Peak around Moray Estate at an elevation similar to that of Horton Plains, which had been deforested around 1890. And here, when the forest is cleared and a hillside is exposed, what has taken over before the arrival of Acacia and before the arrival of Osteoporous was tree ferns. Now, 3 native species of tree ferns grow in Sri Lanka, these species of Kyathea. And Kyathea tree ferns are very good pioneers. As you can see, they've just established like a carpet on this hillside. And we know from an example between Pattipola and Horton Plains, on the hillside we all pass on our way up, that had a landslide around the mid-1960s. When this landslide occurred, it laid bare an entire hillside. And then, before the arrival of these alien invasive species, what first grew on that exposed soil were tree ferns. And now, after half a century, the tree ferns are still there, but under the tree ferns, we can see that the montane forest canopy is slowly emerging. So the tree ferns served as nurse trees, providing shade so that no alien species could take root under them, because alien species, remember, need direct sunlight. And now we have a native forest canopy slowly emerging through the tree fern canopy. And when the native forest canopy grows high enough, it will provide so much shade that it will suppress the tree ferns. So we see this example of succession over a period of half a century. And in the course of maybe the next 50 years, we can see natural forest on this hillside. So this gives us one hint at how we could establish a nurse crop of tree ferns on the land that is the former potato cultivation, those 1,000 acres, that might give us an entry to natural forest regeneration on this land. Now, if I map this area out of former potato cultivation, you can see far in the visitor center as a tiny dot in the middle of that picture. And these 1,000 acres of now pasture grass are the area that we need to focus on, maybe restoring forest on in the future. Now, the fact that this pasture grass is there is great for sambar, because it's a highly nutritious grass, and the sambar come and feed on it. And as a result of that, we have an extraordinarily high population of sambar on Horton Plains. This is unnatural. Even when Samuel Baker was hunting sambar on Horton Plains a century and a half ago, the sambar population was minuscule compared with what it is now. He had to go in search of sambar. Now we have loads of sambar on Horton Plains. So if we try to replace this fodder grass, this pasture grass, for example, by planting tree ferns or by shading it out with shade netting, we can probably get rid of the grass. It will reduce the population of sambar. There again, we need to have a conversation. Do we want a lower population of sambar, or do we want to see sambar grazing on these plains like cattle? Are we happy to see this pasture land being replaced by montane forest, or do we want to see a wide open plains like the British moors, which is what drew the British to this place in the first place? A similar problem occurs when we look at trout on Horton Plains. Trout have been in the stream in the Bellew Lower now for the past 140 years. They're an alien species. They were brought in from California. Should we get rid of them? I think, yes, we should. They're not part of the Sri Lankan ecosystem. Many of you would say, for example, we shouldn't kill animals or even fish in a national park. That's not part of Sri Lankan culture. There would be others who say, look, the trout have been there for 140 years. Whatever damage they were going to do has been done, so why not let them be? There will be yet others who say, yes, but the fishing cats and otters feed on the trout, so trout are an important part of the food chain. So there are multiple points of view, And to arrive at a consensus is why we need to have conversations about managing places like Horton Plains. A few years ago, my friend, Dr. Ruchira Somavira, did a nice study with his colleagues on the use made of gorse of Ulex europaeus by an endemic lizard, Calotes nigrelabris, and showed that calotes were often perching on gorse shrubs and preying on insects that came to nectar on the flowers. Now we've removed the gorse, and calotes is still there, maybe in lower populations and probably with a little less availability of food, because the Ulex buffet that they had earlier is no longer there. So similarly, interventions like reducing the number of sambar or reducing the number of trout are things that I think should be considered. If we go a step further, should we consider reintroducing animals like the gaur, which have been extirpated from Sri Lanka several centuries ago, and look at bringing them back? Now, the gaur are still there in southern India, in the Western Ghats, and we know from so many places like Gaurathanna and Gauravilla in the highlands of Sri Lanka that gaur were once part of this landscape. Should we look at bringing them back? That's a conversation we need to have. Now, when we look at restoration, as I was just explaining about restoring forest on degraded lands like grasslands, we are at the cusp of a beautiful project, which the Wildlife Department is in the very earliest stages of right now. And that is the area on the eastern side of Horton Plains, which I've marked with a red boundary here, which the Wildlife Department has now taken over from the Land Reform Commission, this area of tea, Udavaria estate. And on Udavaria, 700 hectares of tea, massive area. It'll increase the area of Horton Plains National Park by 20%. They are looking at restoring natural forest on this massive area. This is, to my mind, the most ambitious conservation project that has been undertaken in Sri Lanka up to now, because this is terrible land to work with. It's steep, it's prone to hills, to landslides, and also it's got alien species like acacias and eucalypts growing on it. So it needs intensive management. Restoring native forest on this 700 hectares is going to cost billions of rupees. It's going to take decades, but it's one of the most exciting projects I've heard about in Sri Lanka in my lifetime. I hope that institutions like the WNPS will engage with the Wildlife Department to make this happen. Now, finally, the most difficult thing to deal with, the management of visitors. We have millions of people visiting Horton Plains. And there again, we divide into different constituencies. There are people like me who see visitors as an opportunity. There are many others who want to control visitors because they see them as a threat. And we've got almost a political divide between the two groups of people. And we rarely have a conversation. I acknowledge that too many visitors is a problem for Horton Plains. For example, they lead to a lot of road deaths because we've got these tens of thousands of vehicles coming into Horton Plains every year. These vehicles also bring with them all the pollutants and emissions and bad behaviors that drivers can bring up to Horton Plains. But if we look at sustaining the number of visitors, because a park like Horton Plains is important for visitors, and we pay more attention to what visitors are coming to Horton Plains for, I think we can learn something. And here there are many studies, I'm not going to put them up because there are several, done by undergraduate students over the past 5 or 6 years, who've gone and interviewed visitors, foreigners and Sri Lankans who come to Horton Plains, and asked them, what did you come here for? Did you get what you came for? And so on. And most of the visitors, the preponderant majority of visitors who come to Horton Plains, come to have a look over World's End. So I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a cable car system on the World's End side that brought people up there, had a look over the cliff and went down again. The ride alone would be something that people come there just to do. And that takes care of one constituency of visitors who just want a thrill or a nice day out for the family. Not all of them want to trek on the trails on Horton Plains. For those who want to trek on the Horton Plains, I think it's time we stopped private vehicles from coming up to the top of the plains. We can have a good facility at the foot of the plains at Ohio or at Pattipola, car parking, and then have shuttle electric vehicles, cars or small buses, that took people up to the top. That way we reduce noise, we reduce air pollution, and we have more control over driver behaviors. And this means that we can put more infrastructure at the bottom, for example, a modern visitor center at the bottom, one maybe at Ohio, another at Patipola, and one day if we open the entrance from Diagama, another one in that region, where people can spend time, because what people are doing here is having a day out. The vast majority of people just want to have a day out. And if you give them things to do and things to teach their kids on a day out, you're addressing their problem. And if you have a good visitor center that caters to a wide range of interests, I think we can convey a valuable conservation and heritage message. Heritage because the paintings of Ernst Heckl, for example, the German artist, zoologist, famous disciple of Charles Darwin, the paintings of Heckl can be made available for a display there. These were made in the 1980s on his visit to Horton Plains. The paintings of Dorothy Fernando, another brilliant artist who painted the flowers of Horton Plains, for example, could be displayed there. We have this heritage from the Stone Age, from artifacts found on the Horton Plains, and the Stone Age story of Sri Lanka deserves to be told. But perhaps most important of the messages we can tell people is the animals of Horton Plains that are so special. Most visitors to Horton Plains never get to see the animals that make Horton Plains so very special. Samba, for example, occur everywhere in Sri Lanka, in the dry zone, the wet zone, the lowlands, the highlands. But there are so many species that are found only in and around Horton Plains that no one really gets to see apart from scientists. And having a live display, an ex situ conservation center associated with the visitor center that we could have at the bottom of Horton Plains, would be hugely valuable, because it could tell people the stories of these animals, the stories of their ecology, their value in terms of evolution, in terms of Sri Lankan heritage, and in terms of biodiversity science. So the message I've tried to convey to you in this past 30 minutes has been the pivotal importance of science and research in managing a landscape like Horton Plains. Remember, this is just 30 square kilometers. It is a fraction of a tiny fraction of the area, maybe 1% of the area that's managed by the wildlife. It's 1/3 of 1% of the area managed by the wildlife department. The wildlife department manages about 9,000 square kilometers of land, and this is just 30. And if the problems faced by this 30 square kilometers are so intense in terms of a need for research, you can just imagine what our national need for research is. But we still don't have a biodiversity research institution in Sri Lanka. In 2003, again, when I was advising the government on this, and Rukman Senanayake was the minister in charge, we approached the two warring factions of the government at the time, Prime Minister Wickramasinghe on one time and President Kumaratunga on the other, not talking to each other. But we were able to persuade the two of them independently of the need for a national institution for biodiversity research. And they jointly sponsored a cabinet paper which cabinet passed. So there was, across the aisle, political unanimity that we should have a National Institute for Biodiversity Research. Where was the money coming from? Rukman Senanayake and I went and approached donors in many different parts of the world. We were able to get pledges of $22 million US. That's more than 4 billion rupees in today's money. $22 million from 6 different donor agencies who formed a consortium to help us establish this institution. The legal draftsman was empowered to draft a bill in which you can see the first page here. This is 2003. And the idea of the fund, the $22 million that we were given, or going to be given, was that 1/4 of it would be used to put up an institution, a building and infrastructure and equipment. 3/4 of it had to go into a perpetual endowment fund, which would be invested outside of Sri Lanka with international fund managers. And the earnings annually from that fund, estimated to be around 10%, would come to Sri Lanka to be given as grants to the research community in Sri Lanka. So university academics, the Biodiversity Institute itself, and so on. One would have thought that everyone would have said, excellent idea, go for it. But they didn't. Some of the leaders of the Wildlife and Nature Protection Society, ironically, and some of the leaders of the Environmental Foundation and Rukrakaganno started a public campaign, a vitriolic public campaign that spewed a bunch of lies, claiming that this institution would be a vehicle for biopiracy, claiming that the intention was to sell Singaraja to foreigners, and so on. A vitriolic campaign, and making accusations that the donors were in this because they wanted to steal the biodiversity wealth of Sri Lanka. Some of the donors were so offended that they walked away. What happened to the money? It went to India. India has now got 2 brilliant biodiversity research institutions at the expense of Sri Lanka, thanks to the conservation community. I'm telling you this story not because I want to find fault. I'm not even mentioning the names of the people who are behind this because history has forgotten them. They're non-entities. But because we need to learn not to make mistakes like that. They're really expensive mistakes. So when it comes to dealing with biodiversity now, we need to think about engaging with science and building our public policy on the basis of science. We have learned expensive mistakes in managing COVID, for example, by not engaging with science. And how many mistakes do we have to learn? Because these mistakes in biodiversity are expensive. So we need to guide our management philosophy, our values through science. And this is not clear-cut and easy to do. It's difficult. It's difficult because we come to this from different places. I, for example, think that the biggest threat to biodiversity, to the environment in Sri Lanka, comes from poverty. Many of you would think exactly the opposite, that the biggest threat comes from development. Now, you and I, therefore, belong to 2 different political constituencies. I'm not saying political in terms of UNP, SLFP, and political in terms of differences of opinion. And we rarely have opportunities to meet and discuss these and change our minds. But such occasions to change our minds are hugely important. The pandemic has shown us that science is immediately relevant. Now, I meet many conservationists who pay very little attention to science, except when it comes to climate change. If a conservationist meets a climate change denier, there are many of them around, they get really hot under the collar and say, hang on a minute, the science shows that climate change is taking place, but you're not listening to the science. But there are so many occasions on which I hear conservationists not paying attention to the science. Here's a few examples. I hear people in the conservation community talking against vaccines for COVID, not paying attention to the science when it comes to fertilizers. You know the colossal mistake we made 20 years ago in what we did about Epavala, in confusing 2 words, resources and reserves. You should read the judgment of the Supreme Court at the time. I can't comment on it now because I have only respect for the Supreme Court, but they were completely misled by the scientific evidence that was presented to them. That's not to say that I agree with the project that looked at Peafowl at the time. I'm just saying that we have spent billions of dollars in the last 20 years importing triple superphosphate to Sri Lanka as fertilizer, which we could have easily manufactured here in our own country. So we missed a golden opportunity to help ourselves economically. And when we help ourselves economically and enrich our people, we help the environment in turn. We have this ongoing debate between a pesticide agriculture and an organic agriculture. There is no such debate to be had. There's good science on both sides of the divide. It's not to say that organic agriculture is safe. It can often be unsafe. Just 10 years ago in Germany, 53 people died, 4,000 were hospitalized. Dozens of others have chronic kidney disease for life as a result of eating organic fenugreek sprouts, uluhal sprouts. Organic food isn't ipso facto safe to eat. You have to follow the science. There's the safe use of pesticides, and similarly, there's a safe use of organics. So on every area of environmental controversy, we have to remember that if we follow the science, we do ourselves a huge favor. If we follow our gut or our political preferences, we do the whole community an enormous disservice. And that is the message that I want to convey to you today. So once again, I want to thank WNPS for doing this, and a salute to Nations Trust Bank for supporting the work of the WNPS. I wanted to say that because I really respect the work that they've been doing with WNPS for a long time now, for decades now. And finally, I want to thank the wonderful people who helped me with the thinking that went into today's lecture, the images that I showed you, and also the data which I presented to you. I especially want to thank Nimal and Savitri Gunathilaka, who introduced me to the scientific side of thinking about Horton Plains 25 years ago. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions now if you have any.
All right, let's see if I'm back online. Rohan, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I'm trying to stop sharing my screen.
That's fine. I'm sure the team will figure that out. Okay, excellent. Right. There we go. All right, great lecture as always, Rohan. You have your opinions, controversial at times, very interesting to listen to. So that's what these lectures are all about. I mean, looking at the damage done by the, the wonderful Minister of Agriculture once upon a time on that potato, fantasy of theirs. I'm just wondering whether we are looking at a similar thing of elephant corridors in the making, 20, 30 years down the line. I hope not. But like you said, there's lots of science being thrown away. And we're seeing that right now as we speak. The last week or two, we saw an entire scientific study on the elephant issue being just parked away in favor of corridors and things. So we seem to never learn. Okay, so on the gar, and I was looking at Ernst Haeckel's painting, 1882, where he depicts an elephant on, on Horton. So wouldn't it be, I'm provoking you, wouldn't it be more easier to have a conversation on whether elephants should go back to Horton since they're still around, versus I think gar went out in the 17th century or something. So that's obviously going to be a lot of work to bring the gars back. It will be certainly fascinating, but should we put in elephants there first?
That's an interesting question. And I asked this from Dr. Prithviraj Fernando, who knows elephants much better than I do. And he felt that there's too little forest and too little food on Horton Plains now to support a population of elephants. And if we introduce elephants to that landscape, they'd probably start wandering into the tea cultivations and the vegetable cultivations and causing conflict there. So it probably wouldn't be beneficial. So I think the short answer is no, it's not going to work. Gaur are satisfied with much smaller ecological resources, which is why I suggested them. But this is just a fantasy. It's not a serious proposal.
Yeah. So we have some interesting questions, and let me throw one or two. Somebody's asking, what about potential night safaris and things? Would that be one way to kind of, bring out, more visitor viewing of those lovely animals that Horton has? Is that even an option, or would that cause further damage?
I think the problem with night safaris, I've been out at night on Horton Plains on 2 occasions only, like late night. And on both occasions, we came face to face with leopards.
Yeah.
And this is something that I think the wildlife department would worry about, because if there's a leopard attack, it would be a serious risk to their reputation. So I think, I don't know. It's just one of those things that you got to have people signing an indemnity, for example. Yeah, but you see a lot at night that you don't see in the daytime. I mean, the amphibians, for example, and some of the lizards are best seen at night. And it's a much more exciting experience to be on a trail at night with a guide with good eyes. But the problem is, I don't know about the safety aspect of it, because although there's been no leopard attacks on Horton Plains in my memory, there have been leopard attacks in the surrounding landscape, in Diagama, in Agrapatana, and so on. So I think this needs a mature discussion.
Yeah. So I mean, you often refer to this you use this word conversation and discussions. So, I mean, even in this, that Ruchira's interesting study on the black lip lizard and, the interplay between the species and, whether we should take it out, not all these things. Are there such conversations taking place anywhere, or what forums, or, how should these conversations get about? Because nobody seems to be talking much in Sri Lanka on conservation. Somebody talks, somebody does, somebody,
I think there are two places. I mean, the obvious place for the conversation to take place is in the wildlife department. And for that, there's the Fauna and Flora Advisory Committee. I think that committee hasn't been made a pivot often enough. We tried to do this in 2015 by engaging more with members and committee of the Wildlife and Nature Protection Society and with stakeholders like the tourism sector and so on. But it didn't last. It's very difficult to do because the minister appoints the committee and usually the minister puts his friends on this committee and then nothing happens. Even I had the same problem that ministerial friends had to be like nudged out with great difficulty. As a result of one person, a political person trying to muscle into the Fauna and Flora Advisory Committee, for example, we had to ask a friend of mine, Chitral Jayatilaka, who's a respected conservationist, to resign from that committee to make way for a political appointee. So this is the kind of pressure that the Fauna and Flora Advisory Committee comes under, even with somebody like me who's not ashamed to speak my mind, opposing the idea. So that's the logical forum for this conversation to take place. But in many cases where you litigate or you have public action about projects, for example, I think it's good to have that conversation first. I mean, just going back to the example I told you about the friction between the NGO community and the Institute of Biodiversity Science in 2003, it was impossible to sit around a table and have a discussion because people were so angry about an issue about which there shouldn't have been anger. This was a normal issue that we had to discuss. How should we do this best rather than just saying, no, I don't want it. So that's the kind of conversation I'm saying you should have. So I think it would be good for the committee or members of the committee from the WNPS, for example, to have a monthly or every 2 monthly meeting with the senior staff of the wildlife department and say, look, these are priorities that we would like to see happen. How can we help you to achieve these goals? So that then you can take, for example, scientific outcomes like the ones we discussed today and say, how can we roll these out on Horton Plains or in Singaraja or in Yala or wherever?
I mean, I must say in the recent times, we've been starting some discussions on issues at a much lower level than this, certainly. But I think, some semblance of encouraging progress. Where the political angle comes in is the question. We need better high-level backing for some of these. Let me jump into some other questions. I think we spoke about, the expanded presence of Samba and, no good lecture is done without a reference to leopards. I think it's a hot topic. So what do you think the interplay is between the leopard population and the, expanded Samba population? There have been increasing research studies now going on. Dr. Inoka and others are studying, some of these things there. What is your take on these two aspects?
I have only anecdotal evidence on this, but I think I'll just mention a couple of anecdotes. So for sure, leopards eat Samba. There's no doubt about it. But I've been surprised. There's a few Samba around the dormitories that are really tame. And they always hang around the dormitories. If I were an enterprising leopard, I'd have eaten them by now. But these Samba, despite being tame, still manage to persist there. I don't know how. At a site in Agrapatana that I used to work on, there was a lame Samba. He'd probably as a result of an explosive or something, and he was hopping around, not able to run. Lived there for a long time, despite having leopards on the same property. Our camera traps would catch the leopards very often, but they were not eating the Samba. So I think the leopards probably have enough food, and they probably have a diversity of food, because when you look at leopards' cats, you see that they eat a wide range of animals, not just large mammals. And so I think the Samba population is more than equal to the predation pressure from leopards.
Mm-hmm. There have been studies speaking about, this, you get a very distinct boundary
between the grassland and some of the other fauna in Horton, right? Give us your take on that. There have been different studies over time. What drives that so in such a punctured manner?
So the so-called ecotone between the forest and the grassland in the Nilgiris is very stable. In the Horton Plains, it's not as stable. I think in the Nilgiris, the reason is because frost occurs in the grassland, but frost doesn't really occur in the forest. The understory of the forest is several degrees warmer, even on the coldest night, than the grassland. Also, the understory of the forest isn't exposed to wind. Even on a really windy day, if you walk into a montane forest, once you've gone in 5 or 10 meters, there's no wind. It's very still. So the forest acts as an insulator, which stays much warmer than the grassland. As a result of that, forest trees can only invade the grassland very slowly because most forest trees cannot grow if there's frost, especially when they're saplings. That's why rhododendron preferentially grows on the grassland, because rhododendrons are impervious to frost. If you think the vast majority of rhododendron species occur in much higher altitudes in places like Bhutan and in the foothills of the Himalayas, because this group of plants is resistant, impervious to frost. In Horton Plains, they can grow in the grassland because the grasslands get frosty and rhododendrons can survive frost. But most montane forest species, especially when they're saplings, will die if they get frosted up, they get frozen. So I think that keeps the ecotone more or less stable, or slowly moving into the grassland and slowly invading the grassland, but only by a few % every year.
Good. Somebody's, Rukshan's just put a quick note saying that they do hear of leopards killing some of the sambas which hang around. So maybe times have changed.
Good, good.
Let me throw something on another favorite topic when you talk of Horton, which is on the Nilu. And, this once in a dozen years, and, it goes back to some of the early writings, Heckle's time and even before, and, it's so well documented. Are we seeing any expansion of Nilu outside of the park? Or is it contracting when it comes into bloom? Any studies on that? Anything we...
Well, there's one lady in the wildlife department, Mrs. Nilanthi Rajapaksa, who specializes in Strobilanthes, the genus of Nelu. And I think there's no real expansion because Nelu is an understory shrub. It grows almost entirely in the shade of the forest canopy. So there's no forest, there's no Nelu, but there are a couple of species, of course, that grow in open land. But the vast majority of species of Strobilanthes grow in the shade of the forest canopy. So there'll only be as much Nelu as there is forest, unfortunately. But we have, more than a dozen species in Sri Lanka. And I don't know whether they have been closely monitored, but Nilanthi's work has been a great example to follow. And I think she was hoping to publish a small book on this subject. I don't know if that's come out because I've been overseas for the past couple of years.
Right. I mean, we were speaking of expanding forest cover. There's a question whether we think that, with an expansion of forest cover, the sponge effect you were talking about, what would happen in that whole equation? Would there be too much absorption? Would that still sustain itself or alter some of the ecosystem?
I don't think that you can have too much forest. Like the more forest we have, the better. The example, okay. I think the example I gave you from Costa Rica is that when the forest occurs, montane forest occurs as islands, like Horton Plains is an island surrounded by a agricultural landscape, then the clouds tend to go up and don't pass through the forest canopy. So you starve the forest of water from the mist. So the bigger the islands of forest that we can generate, the better. That's why I'm excited by this Uraveria project by the Wildlife Department. I mean, that's a huge opportunity for conservation. in the montane landscapes. And it's the first time in Sri Lanka that we'll be trying to forest with native vegetation, a substantial area of any part of the highlands of Sri Lanka. It reverses the depredation caused by the tea planters of a century and a half ago.
Let's spend a little bit of time on some of the lesson on, talk to us a little bit of some of the uniqueness of the amphibian fauna. I mean, there's some very interesting things which happen in Horton on that front.
I think the majority of amphibians on Horton Plains are so-called direct developers. They don't have tadpoles. These species, about a dozen species in Horton Plains, lay their eggs on the forest soil. And the eggs go through the whole stage of tadpole within the egg. So they don't lay eggs in water. But for this to work, the forest soil has to be moist. If the forest soil dries up, the eggs die or the amphibians don't breed. So drying up, aridification, desiccation, lengthening dry periods are all a threat to the amphibians in Horton Plains. Even the ones that deposit their eggs in the water, studies led by Dr. Anselm de Silva, for example, have shown that they have an extraordinary amount of deformities occurring in these frogs. And the reasons for these deformities are not yet understood. We assume that they might be caused by pollutants. They might be caused, for example, by agricultural pesticides that are coming in with the wind. We don't know. And that's why this intensive monitoring that I'm talking about is so important, that we need to monitor the chemistry of the wind, the chemistry of the mist and the rain and so on, so that we can get a better grip on the threats that this ecosystem faces from the environment.
I mean, many years ago, I have two experiences which stuck in my mind. One was, of course, once in a lifetime thing. Late 80s, we were coming back in a van at, dusk, and we had two leopard sightings, one of which was a leopard chasing a rabbit right in front of the vehicle for about 30, 50 meters. So it's just phenomenal. But the other one I recall was on seeing Aspidura there. And so I'm just curious, there's a question also, we see a lot of invasion of peacocks into many parts of the country, and in turn a lot of little snakes, lizards, all these unique species start getting hit left, right and center. What do you think the risks are of peacocks invading Horton?
I think that they're already. I think I've heard it said or seen a photograph on the internet of peacocks in the montane forest environment. I'm not sure whether it's Horton Plains, but it would not be surprising because peafowl have come quite far into the wet zone over the last couple of decades. I don't know what's driving that, but it certainly deserves to be studied. I don't even know whether peafowl are native to Sri Lanka. This is another question that we're not sure of. So there's room for research there also.
In number of the the comments you were making, you were alluding to a fact, and it's also interesting for me. Why is there so little study done in some of these areas? I mean, we see people wanting to get into research. We see people falling over each other trying to do the same research over and over again sometimes, but it seems to be there's a huge vacuum of many areas for doing research. Is it because we don't have the supervision capabilities or the funding or the guidance? What do you think is, where is the gap here?
So I think a large part of the problem is that we don't have many people involved in this line of research. We don't, and this is why we need an institution. We are one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have a wildlife institution. India had the Wildlife Institution of India at Dehradun, like for the last, 40 or 50 years. We still don't have a wildlife research institution in Sri Lanka or a biodiversity research institution and now in India, there's probably a dozen big institutions. And if you think, where would medical research be in our country for managing issues like dengue or rabies or malaria if we didn't have a medical research institution? And the MRI, for example, has been pivotal in even handling issues like childhood nourishment in Sri Lanka. The Triposha program was led by the Medical Research Institution, which dramatically changed outcomes for poor children in our country. And that's because we had specialized nutritionists working in that environment who were coming up with the scientific answers to the problem of malnutrition or of malaria or of rabies management. For wildlife, there is no such pivotal institution. We are distributed amongst universities where a few academics in their spare time will go and do research because they have teaching responsibilities. And then there are students. But there's virtually no dedicated biodiversity research happening in Sri Lanka because of the lack of an institution. That's why that institution was so important. And unfortunately, we've missed that bus because when you think about it, from 1993, when the Rio Convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity, was signed, for about 10 years, the whole world's aid institutions were focused, like the Global Environment Fund and so on, were focused on biodiversity. That was the decade of biodiversity. And that's how we managed to get that funding, as much as $22 million for an institution. If you try to do that today, you don't stand a chance because the radar of donors has moved away from that. Now they're more focused on poverty. And for the next few years, they're going to be focused on COVID relief. So the attention of donors changes from time to time. And that's why institutions are so important. I don't think we stand a chance of having a biodiversity institution for the next maybe at least 5 years, maybe the next 10 at least. So we have to make do with what we have for the moment. But we missed a fantastic opportunity. And I'll take that to my grave with me because it was such a big opportunity for Sri Lanka that we just kicked in the guts for reasons I never understood.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question asked earlier. You kind of answered part of it around, where is all this science going to come from? And I think, like you're saying, if we can get the institutions and things going, because I guess there's a huge disillusionment around the fact that science isn't respected and consulted enough by the policymakers in all this decision making, which we are seeing on a almost day-to-day basis, where the decisions of conservation are really being, questioned in the current context. So, yeah, so there's another angle of whether the DWC could be the prime mover to kind of set something like that up. Do you think that would ever be a reality, or should it be an independent institution? Or
I think it has to be outside of the DWC. If you look at the conservation management institutions in other countries, even in developed countries like New Zealand or Australia, the side of scientific research is separated from the management of national parks and so on. I don't think these two things can be mixed up because the specializations that the staff need are completely different. You can have interaction, of course, between the two communities, but as I mentioned in my introductory comments, the park staff of the DWC do a fantastic job, not just in Horton Plains, but in so many other environments. These guys are not paid well. I mentioned 300 million rupees a year as being how much we would have earned from the Conservation Fund for research. But the entire recurrent expenditure budget of the DWC for a year, 225 million rupees. It is a drop in the ocean. You're spending 1 billion on elephant fencing in an environment when the Wildlife Department has to manage 9,000 square kilometers of land in national parks and almost 2,000 members of staff with just 225 million rupees. Many of us work in companies whose annual turnover is many times that much, And so our investment is tiny. And we need to compartmentalize this because academics need to do research and Wildlife Department needs to do management. And these two things can interact, but they should never be mixed up because then you have somebody saying, oh, I need to be the Director General of Wildlife because I've got more qualifications or I've got a PhD. Not necessarily. The Director General of Wildlife has to be a really good manager. He doesn't need to be a rocket scientist. So I think we need to think about this more carefully before thinking that these institutions can be mixed up. That would be dangerous.
Okay, so we are drawing to a close. I mean, I can go on. So many more questions. This is a fantastic topic, but let me throw one or two last ones at you. I mean, Horton has such a lovely diversity of species, whether it was the Spidura or the Arenga that everyone runs to photograph, or the otters, or the blue admirals on the butterfly side, or the hump-nosed lizards, all kinds of things. Give me your three favorite, most elusive species in Horton and why.
So I would say the three that I like is Sri Lanka miss, the mouse.
Okay.
I showed a picture of it. It's the cutest mouse on the planet with this white belly and lovely tan fur. I've only seen one specimen because we were allowed to trap one specimen on Horton Plains, and that's probably the only photograph of Sri Lanka miss there is ever taken. Is the one that I showed you there. It's a beautiful mouse, and this is a genus that is endemic to Sri Lanka, and one that I think we need to learn more about, and that's why we need like a captive breeding center, an ex situ conservation center, where we can learn how these animals breed and reproduce and live, and how they can be managed in captivity if their wild population goes down. The other would also be a small mammal, which is, it's a tough mix between Feroculus and Solicerex, which are both species of shrews, insectivores. They're both like Hickmeas. And the third one would be a species of frog, which is Pseudophyllautus femoralis. It's this beautiful green frog that also lays green eggs, and it sticks its green eggs onto leaves. And when the eggs hatch, the little froglets fall down to the forest floor and continue their life from there. So those would be my three favorites. And they're all small animals that most people wouldn't pay attention to, but I think they're so fascinating that I think we should be paying much more attention to such species.
Second question that I had before I close, Rohan, I remember last time when you spoke several years ago at WNPS, you're talking about some of the project you were doing around reforesting and that arboreum and some of that work. Just give us a glimpse of how things are going with that before we wrap up.
Yes, so I sold that property, but to someone who's better able to take care of it than I was, because the investment in the property now is an order of magnitude greater than I was able to do. And to my delight, the gentleman who now owns it is even more committed towards the conservation potential of this land than I was. So he's doing everything I was doing and some more.
That's great to hear.
And part of the reason I wanted to find a new owner for that property, because both my sons were not interested in this. And in the case of the gentleman who now owns it, his children are very committed to this property. So there is a long-term future for this project. But we have learned so much from that project over the last 20 odd years that we can now put to use when it comes to doing a project like the Udaveria project that the Wildlife Department has just started doing. So I think we can accelerate processes like Udaveria. And even the examples I gave you, like the tree ferns being used as pioneer or nurse species, for example, or how to suppress Osteoporous. These are all lessons that were learned on that property. And now we have those answers. So we have a recipe for going into the future as a result of that 20 years of investment and lessons learned from that property at Agrapatana. So it's an ongoing project, but already it has paid rich dividends in being able to speed up future initiatives on forest restoration in Sri Lanka.
So just for the audience, if any of you, if this heightened your interest in Horton, that's a book that Rohan and a number of other people did many years ago on Horton, one of the most fascinating books available. And you'll find, lots of the richness that was described today being more vividly covered in that book. Rohan, thank you very much. As always, it was a fascinating lecture. I'm glad the weather held and the tech didn't let us down. So I think audiences, we had several hundred from the count that I'm seeing. And I think, many people benefited from this, and I'm envisioning, a lot more people are going to probably be watching this recording as well, because this is hot topic, and your inputs have always been widely regarded in different ways. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest even after the lecture to watch the recording. So thank you very, very much. And please do continue this wonderful work and share all the great knowledge that you have gained over the years with the younger generation, which you've always been doing. Let me close out by thanking our sponsors, Nations Trust Bank. Rohan did a better spin on that than I did, right? But they've like we heard, they've been wonderful to work with over the years, and different presidents and WNPS committees have benefited from that partnership. I must say, Rohan, that we've also benefited by a larger number of corporate partners who have come to support us these last few years. So unlike, say, a decade ago, I think we have, 10, 15 good, strong corporate partners who now support us in many, many ways. We are surrounded by more scientists coming in, and what's more exciting is there's a lot of young people. The youth wing is very active, and a lot of young people coming in to kind of engage in the conservation conversation. So hopefully exciting times, and we hope we can preserve these things for the future. At times it does seem daunting, and we look at all the horror stories, and you worry whether we are making progress. But every now and then people like you shine a ray of hope, and I think science is what will probably come to our rescue in that context. So thank you very much. Thanks to the back-end tech team at WNPS and all the committee and everyone who makes these talks possible, and to so many of our corporate partners. Look forward to catching many of you in our future lectures. And like I said, please watch out get on our website, because we'll be probably accelerating some of the talks that we do on line these days, given the restrictions that keep coming now, given the situation. So please stay safe, look after yourselves, and as we always say, please ensure you're a net positive contributor for conservation. Don't be one of these people who just runs with your cameras and spends all that money and gets a lot of joy in the photographs you take, and don't do a damn thing about conservation. Please balance your roles in society. And thank you very much to everyone. Wish you all a good night. Thank you once again, Rohan, and wish you all the best. Good night.